thanks again to the Brookings Institution for organizing this and including me. I'm Brian Phelan from DePaul University. This is joint work with Daniel Aronson at the Chicago Fed. So I believed I'm required to say that this does not represent the views of the Federal Reserve System. It's just the views, our own views here. So I'm going to be talking about low-wage automation. So a little bit of a pivot here, but not really. So as we've been talking about today, the fear of automation is ubiquitous. And there's some reason for that, though. There's fairly extensive evidence that automation has played a big role in this carving out of the middle class, both in terms of job polarization or the rise in income inequality, where essentially automation has replaced a lot of middle class jobs, and what it's put in place are increased growth at the top end of the spectrum and the bottom end of the spectrum. And for a lot of middle-class workers, they're not necessarily qualified for the newly created jobs at the top of the spectrum, and so they find themselves moving into lower-skill, lower-paying jobs, and this has played a big role in the rise in inequality. Much less is actually known, though, about automation of low-skill jobs, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. So why is the automation of low-skill jobs important for the middle class? I'd argue for at least two reasons, maybe three actually. So first, a lot of middle-class households are composed of multiple workers, and some of them are going to be working in low-skill jobs. So understanding what's happening in terms of automation at the low-wage piece of the spectrum is going to be important for middle class as well. Another reason is that, as I said before, with job polarization, a lot of what's happened with this sort of disappearing middle skill jobs is that there's been this creation of lower skill jobs, with sort of the belief being that these are not necessarily automatable jobs. So what's sort of cushioned, in some sense, the fall has been the creation of these low-skill jobs. On the other hand, if low-skill jobs are also subject to automation, that could pose additional problems there. The third thing that I would sort of say is that what we're going to be using here to try and understand whether low-skill automation is taking place is we're going to be using the minimum wage. So essentially an increase in the minimum wage is going to change the relative price of capital and labor, and then we're going to see how that changes the composition of the low-wage labor market, the composition of employment. And so if we think about the minimum wage as being a potential policy lever to counteract some of these effects, we'll be able to say a little bit about that. So generally, there's very limited evidence that low-wage jobs are being automated. And I should say that when I'm talking about low-wage jobs here, I'm largely thinking about things that are, I guess, somewhere in the $10 to $15 an hour range, low-skill service sector type jobs. I'll show you some examples in a little bit, though, to give you some sense of which jobs are going to fall in here. But roughly jobs that pay up to about 150% of the minimum wage. So there's fairly limited evidence that this has been taking place. For a long time, it was largely just assumed that it wasn't taking place, right? And there was probably good reason to believe that. For a long time, right, automation technology was expensive. And so to try and think about replacing low-skill, low-wage service sector jobs was just not really economically feasible. The price of technology continues to fall, and so it's quite possible now that low-skill jobs could be automated as well. So there are some recent studies, though, that have started to look at this question. And as I mentioned, minimum wage is going to be the key driver here for these studies. They're not necessarily thinking that minimum wage is causing these, although we can make those connections, but we're really using minimum wage as sort of a shock to the relative price of capital. So when the minimum wage goes up, right, in those states, the relative price of capital goes down, and so we're going to look and see. So some studies have looked specifically at capital adoption, and then some have taken the second approach that we're going to do, which is look at sort of the change in the composition of the labor force. So all of these papers that sort of look at actual capital adoption when the minimum wage goes up, these are all very recent working papers, all within the last year or two. Only one of them is accepted at a journal, so this is very new research. And as I said, part of the reason why this may be new is just because it wasn't economic it didn't make economic sense for businesses to invest in this for a long period of time, but that doesn't mean it's not happening now. So those that look at actual capital adoption, in the US, it's difficult to get that type of firm level or even industry level information. So most of those studies have focused on other countries, and there's some mixed evidence across the six, well, there's 4 mentioned up here, but 6 studies. I think the overarching effect is it does seem to be that there's this expedited capital adoption when the minimum wage goes up. The second types of studies look at sort of the change in the composition of employment. And Dan and I have a different paper that we look over the period 1999 to 2009 to try and see when the minimum wage goes up in certain states whether there is a relative change in the types of jobs in those states compared to other states. David Newmark and Grace Lorden also have a paper that do something somewhat similar. And so both of these studies, both of us find that low-wage automation does seem to be taking place. There's some differences between the 2 studies. Generally, we find that there's no net decrease in overall employment, whereas Lorden and Newmark find some net decline in employment. So what are we going to do different in this paper? Well, really, what we want to do first is just to try and understand how low-wage automation has changed over time. Specifically from the first decade of the 21st century to the second decade, right? As I mentioned, our earlier study only went up through 2009, and now we're going to be looking from 2010 to 2018. And I think at its face value, right, the cost of technology, the price of technology has gone down quite a bit over those 2 decades, and so and wages continue to rise, especially with a lot of the recent increases in the minimum wage. That this could be the rate of this type of adoption could be growing. We're also going to look at one change that's happened recently is that a lot of minimum wage policies have moved to city level or MSA level, and so we're going to examine this at the city level as well. We're going to be using, for our main analyses, we're going to be using the Occupation Employment Statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics data source that has occupational total employment levels by state and then also by MSA. We're also going to look at what we do different in this paper, as well as that we want to look at heterogeneity to try and understand whether different types of workers are going to be disproportionately affected by low-wage automation. And for that, we're going to be using the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey, I'll talk a little bit more, but it's going to allow us to disaggregate these employment totals in terms of looking at somebody like less educated workers, younger workers, men, women, and minorities. Those are the groups we're going to look at. So just to sort of summarize what we're going to find, we find that minimum wages continue to spur automation of low-wage jobs. And our approach here, like I said, is going to be looking at occupational employment. So it sort of follows this routine bias technological change story, which when minimum wages go up, we're going to see jobs that are intensive in routine tasks decline. Interestingly, we get employment gains, however, at jobs that are intensive in interpersonal tasks. And a lot of the declines in routine jobs will be offset by this increased growth in jobs intensive in interpersonal tasks. As we compare the first decade of the 21st century to the second decade, we find that this effect accelerates dramatically. The effects in the second decade from 2010 to 2018 are 2.5 times the size of the effects that we found in the first decade of the 21st century. And it's going to spread to a broader range of jobs. In our first study, we see that it was just the routine cognitive jobs are declining. Now it's both routine cognitive jobs and routine manual jobs. We get some sort of noisy results about the overall employment effect. As I said before, in our first study, looking at the first decade, we found that the growth of these interpersonal jobs offset all of the decline in routine jobs. We get some mixed evidence that maybe the offsetting employment growth now in interpersonal jobs may not be enough to offset the declines in routine jobs. And so I'll talk about that. As I said, we look at heterogeneity. We see vast differences by geography. Largely, when we look at this effects coming from minimum wage hikes, these tend to be in smaller cities and rural areas. And that it's going to disproportionately affect sort of the most vulnerable workers within low-skilled jobs. We're going to be looking within jobs, right, within occupations, and it's the most vulnerable workers within those jobs that are most affected by this change. And so less educated workers, younger workers, and minorities are going to be disproportionately affected. So let me just sort of brief outline of my talk here. I'm going to very briefly give you some theoretical framework for thinking about this. No equations, I promise. Then I'm going to talk about the data that we use. And I'm going to spend a little time going through some summary stats, because a lot of this stuff actually really comes out in the summary stats. Then I'll talk about our empirical specification and some results, and finish with a brief conclusion. So just in terms of sort of a theoretical framework, so the standard competitive model of minimum wage hikes would say that when minimum wages go up, right, low wage employment declines because of both our scale and substitution effects. So when we think about the effects on other inputs, though, whether we're thinking about capital or other types of labor, they're going to decline because of the scale effect, but they could increase because of the substitution effect. And so we don't know what happens to capital adoption, what happens to other types of labor when the minimum wage goes up. It depends upon whether they're gross substitutes or gross complements with low wage, the lowest wage workers. However, it's not unreasonable to think that there could be heterogeneity even within low-wage jobs, right? Essentially, that the substitution effect within low-wage work doesn't have to be the same, right? So if we work with the routine biased technological change story, it's the routine low-wage jobs that are going to have these larger substitution effects when the minimum wage goes up, right? And so we would expect employment to decline more there. It's also possible that similarly paying, but other types of low-wage jobs could possibly be complementary to the adoption of capital to replace these routine jobs. And so it's possible actually that there could be this offsetting employment growth. In the paper and in other papers, we sort of speculate lots of different ways that this could work. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but I'm not going to go into too many details now. But so this sort of basic framework of the employment response is going to guide exactly what we're going to do empirically, which is that since this substitution effect could be different across low-wage jobs based upon the tasks that they do, we're going to be estimating sort of the heterogeneity or the variation in the employment response across different types of jobs in the low-wage labor market. All right, so in terms of the employment data that we use, we're going to be using, all of this is going to be occupation level. We're going to aggregate up. So we're going to use the occupation employment statistics, which is occupation level data. But even when we use the American Community Survey, we're going to aggregate that up to occupation level. So if you're not familiar with the occupation employment statistics, it's a firm level survey. Each release is based on 1.2 million firm surveys. It is backward looking. It's a 3-year moving average because it's based on over the last 6 surveys. We're going to be looking at, so what does it do? It provides total occupation employment levels by state, but also by MSA and different data sources. And they also give you information on average wages and different points in the distribution there. We're going to be using the average wages of the occupation, though, to try and distinguish between those jobs that are likely to be affected, right? Because it's not just routine jobs that are going to be affected, but low-wage routine jobs. And so the average wage information there is going to be particularly important. So we're going to bin occupations by their average wage to the minimum wage over the panel 2010 to 2018. And so, right, if the minimum wage is $10 and a cashier gets on average wages $12, right, then they have a wage to minimum wage ratio of 1.2. And so we're going to group occupations that way so that we can distinguish between those most likely to be affected. We're also going to use the American Community Survey. As I said, the ACS is a 1% sample of the US population. We're going to use the ACS to compute, to create a panel of state occupation employment levels. And then we're looking over a very similar time period. We haven't added in 2018 yet. It was just released a few weeks ago. But we're going to bin occupations in the same way. So we'll focus in on those low-wage routine jobs. All right, the minimum wage data, this comes from Vaghol and Zipperer, who've made it, have made this available and easy to use. In terms of the variation in our data, there's been quite a bit of increases in the minimum wage over the period that we're looking at, 2010 to 2018. 29 states, including DC, have increased their minimum wage over that period, right? So you can think of effectively as those are our treatment states. We'll compare what happens to employment in those states versus the 22 states that did not increase their minimum wage. We are going to drop all of those states that had automatic inflation-based adjustments over much of the period. 10 of those 29 are just sort of going up a few percent each year based on inflation. In terms of categorizing occupations, we're going to use the task data from Asamoglu and Otter 2011. They're using ONET to classify the 664 SOC occupations in terms of these 6 characteristics. They were broken down earlier. It's effectively routine, non-routine, and then cognitive and manual. The one difference is that there's a distinguish here in terms of interpersonal. And so they actually have a cognitive interpersonal and a manual interpersonal. And we're going to combine those into a single interpersonal measure. Instead of classifying occupations as just being just routine or just interpersonal, we're going to compute what's a task share. And so each occupation is going to have some proportion of it that's going to be routine cognitive and some proportion that's interpersonal. And so we're going to use those task shares to distinguish between, again, the sort of these compositional changes in employment. So this is just, there's a lot of numbers, but this is to give you some sense of these are the top 20 most routine intensive low-wage occupations. So here, the way that I'm defining a low-wage occupation is it had to have an average wage to minimum wage ratio in one state of at least less than 1.5. Because our lowest wage group are going to be average wage to minimum wage ratios less than 1.5, right? So if the minimum wage is $10, these occupations had an average wage less than 15, right? So what you have here is, one, you can see between these occupations what their average wage to minimum wage ratio across all states is, to give you some sense. Here's our share routine. And so in this table, actually, I'm combining routine cognitive and routine manual. So something like a motion picture projectionist is going to be highly routinized, a textile and garment presser, a greater sorter of agricultural products. And so you get some sense about how important these occupations are. There's a lot of small occupations, but there's one, very important one here. Cashiers show up as being highly routinized. Highly routinized, and also a very large piece of the low-wage labor market. So this is one way to sense what are those low-wage occupations that are highly routinized. One thing to point out here is just overall employment trends here. We see about 4%. So this is over the entire period 2010 to 2018. These jobs aren't totally shrinking, but they're not growing particularly rapidly either. Here are our highest interpersonal. So I'm sort of previewing our results a little bit again. We're going to see that interpersonal job growth occurs when the routine employment declines. And so I want to highlight that here in the statistics. So some things that have been mentioned so far a lot. Personal and home care aides has been a rapidly growing low-wage occupation. There was talk about it before. It is very low paying. The average wage to minimum wage ratio is 1.33, so approximately 33% over the minimum wage. These are low-paying jobs, but they're rapidly growing. Generally, if we look across those jobs that are mostly interpersonal, an average growth rate of about 21%. Yeah? Is the average just for those 20 or for all those jobs? These are just for these 20. Yes. So this is just to distinguish, to give you some sense in terms of summary stats. So I want to take this one step further and just sort of, before we sort of run our regressions and sort of say, okay, what does minimum wage do? What I want to sense is what are the overall employment trends here in the low-wage labor market? And what you see is that they mirror quite well what's happened to middle-skilled jobs as well. It's just this is now taking place later. So what does this show is that now I said before I was going to use shares, but now I'm grouping occupations. So these are the routine occupations are going to be all those occupations where these are low-wage occupations where the routine share is less than 1.5. Where the routine share is less or is at least 50%, and the interpersonal jobs are going to be the ones where the interpersonal share is at least 50%. So these are majority interpersonal or routine. We're going to base everything relative to 2010. So what you see here is clearly over time in these low-wage occupations, routine jobs are declining. The highest growth is occurring in interpersonal jobs, and other jobs are generally growing, but not nearly as fast as the interpersonal. So overall, when you look at the low-wage labor market, you see things very similar happening in the low piece of the lower wage portion of the labor market. So now I also want to sort of, with summary stats, sort of show you that minimum wages may be playing a role here. So now I'm just going to show you the routine occupations, and then I'll show you the interpersonal and all others. And so the blue line are going to be where I'm basing employment growth for states that didn't increase their minimum wage, and the red lines are going to be states that did increase their minimum wage. And then in the blue bars here are going to be the average minimum wage increase across those states that did increase their minimum wage. So generally, the employment trends in these two states follow each other quite closely up until about 2014 when the minimum wage starts to increase. And so we see that there's an increased decline in the routine intensive occupations in those states that increase their minimum wage. The opposite happens when we look at the interpersonal jobs. So it's one thing, you might look at this and say, well, that's just the effect of minimum wages, that they decrease all employment. I'm going to show you that this is really unique compared to all other types of jobs. So here you look at interpersonal jobs. These are going to be intensive in interpersonal tasks. Again, majority interpersonal. The two states, minimum wage states in red, non-minimum wage states in blue, follow each other quite closely. The divergence doesn't happen nearly as quickly with interpersonal, but the divergence does occur, and we see that there's elevated levels of this interpersonal job growth in the states that increase their minimum wage. When we look at all other jobs, we see no effects. So something unique about minimum wage is happening here that I'll show you in the regressions as well. You're going to see it changes the composition of low wage jobs. And I'm also going to then show you now how this differs over time and that it's accelerated. So here, regardless of whether they increase their minimum wage or not, they follow the same trajectory. All right, so what's the regression that we're going to estimate? We're going to estimate, I'm just going to show you one equation, a difference in difference specification. We're going to be looking at long differences in employment outcomes in an occupation, in a state, in a year. Those are going to be 4-year employment changes. Excuse me, 4-year employment changes. We're going to be grouping, like I said, occupations in terms of these wage groupings. And so then this is going to give us, the effects of the change in the log minimum wage for those different wage groupings. We're going to focus on those that are closest to the minimum. That's going to be between the minimum wage and 1.5 times the minimum wage. That's our wage group 1. Wage group 2 is going to be from 1.5 times the minimum wage to 2 times the minimum wage. Wage group 3 is from 2 to 2.5, and then wage group 4 is everyone else, up to 6 times the minimum wage. So we're going to estimate these overall. This will be our overall employment effect of the minimum wage hike. And then this is going to tell us what's the differential employment response depending upon the task share of the occupation. And so we'll do this for routine task share, interpersonal task share, and so forth. We're going to have state year, wage group, and occupation fixed effects in the specification. One thing to keep in mind is that we're going to have we have a long difference in the outcome, a 4-year change. We're going to have 1-year changes in the minimum wage. So it's not a pure long difference specification. It's a long difference in the outcome, but more like a distributed lag specification in the change in the minimum wage. And so that means our key beta coefficients here will represent cumulative effects rather than, say, marginal effects if it was a pure distributed lag model. So we're going to cluster standard errors at the state and weight observations by the base year employment level. We also going to control for the task share of the occupation and allow that to vary over time because of these trends that I just showed you in that figure, that these things are trending over time. All right, I'll skip that. So I'm going to first show you the results for all the wage groups. Hopefully convince you that all of the action is happening in that lowest wage group. And then I'm just going to show you the wage group 1 results going forward. Remember, so it doesn't work. Wage group 1 is just the lowest wage jobs. Those are between minimum wage and 1.5 times the minimum wage. This is the overall employment effect in the first 4 columns for the different wage groups. in the specification here, sometimes pretty much in all of the coefficients that show the relative employment response, we're going to include state by year fixed effects. And so that's what we have here. This is going to be just the relative employment response in routine cognitive jobs. So one thing in terms of the overall employment response, and this is different from our last study in terms of what we get. It's sort of hard to see, but what we have here is the minimum wage changing next year, right? So that'd be, it changes 1 year from now. That's our leading effect. And then the minimum wage changed just this past year. It changed 1 year ago, and it changed 2 years ago. So it gives you some sense of the dynamics of the employment adjustment. So when you look at the 2-year effect, 2 years after a minimum wage hike, you don't see anything in terms of any major effects. But what you do see is relative to the leading effect, you see that employment is declining. And so the difference between the lead effect and the 2-year effect, we do get some slightly negative coefficients here around negative 0.2, which is sort of at the upper end of the minimum wage literature. These are elasticities. And so you should be thinking about them as, say, okay, when minimum wage goes up 10%, what happens to overall employment? So an elasticity of negative 0.2 would be minimum wage goes up 10%, employment goes down 2%. These are going to be our interaction terms between the change in the minimum wage and then the task content of the job. What we've done with these shares, these task shares, is that we've standardized them so that they're z-scores. So this is an elasticity for every standard deviation increase in the amount of routine jobs. So for every standard deviation increase in the routine task share. So what does this show? It shows that as the minimum wage goes up, you see that routine employment or employment at jobs that are intensive in routine tasks declines. And so the elasticity is if you're 1 standard deviation above average in your routine task share, minimum wage goes up 10%, employment goes down 1%, here about 2%. So we see no real, like I said, no effect on the higher wage intervals. So what do we see here just overall is that you see maybe some employment declines. This is a little noisy and not what you'd want in terms of the leading effect, but very clear declines at routine cognitive jobs. Employment declines. That's just isolated to the lowest wage occupations, which are the ones that you would expect to be affected by the minimum wage hike. So we don't just want to look at routine cognitive. So now I'm jumping, by the way. I'm just going to show you this column here of results for all of the different task shares. So from different regression specifications to give you some sense of what's the overall employment change across the low wage labor market. And so you see when the minimum wage goes up, these are just duplicates of the coefficients I just showed you, the decline in those routine cognitive jobs. We see that routine manual jobs are also declining. So those that are intensive in the routine manual task share, they're also declining when the minimum wage goes up. But there is this offsetting employment growth. Employment is growing at jobs that are intensive in interpersonal tasks. This all happens with a lag. It doesn't happen right away, right? It happens within 1 to 2 years after the minimum wage increase, and it seems to be growing over time. And this makes a lot of sense if this is capital adoption that's taking place, right? We don't expect substitution effects to be immediate, right? Capital adoption takes time. It can be lumpy, and so the fact that this is coming up 1 to 2 years after makes a lot of sense to us. On the other hand, we see no real effects at non-routine jobs, which is reassuring to us since we don't think about these as being automatable jobs. I didn't mention it before, but largely low-wage jobs don't have a lot of non-routine activities. If I went back, most of them are sort of 20%, if you will. Largely, they're interpersonal or they're routine cognitive or routine manual. So this is the overall effects in the occupation employment statistics using that state-level data. But I want to show you how these compare from what we found in our earlier paper. So in red, we have our estimated effects from 1999 to 2009. These are basically plotting out these elasticities. And so they should be interpreted, like I said, as this for every, given a certain percent increase in the minimum wage and for a standard deviation increase in each of the tasks. So in red, we have 99 to our first study, and then we've got our estimates here using the more recent decades. So when you look across, so for example, if you look at routine cognitive, you can see that these things are diverging from each other. with routine manual, when we look from 99 to 09, we found no real effects in overall routine manual low-wage employment. Now we see minimum wage hikes decreasing employment at routine manual jobs. When we combine all routine tasks together, right, so that's basically the sum of that routine cognitive share and the routine manual share, this is where you get that 2.5 times effect. The effect is 2.5 times, just in terms of the coefficient, 2.5 times size, 2.5 times the size of the effect. So we see that automation is accelerated. It's spread to a broader range of jobs. And the increase in interpersonal jobs has also expanded. But I'll present a little bit more. There is maybe some evidence to say that the growth in the interpersonal jobs is not fully offsetting this decline in routine jobs. So what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of things. One, we're going to estimate this with the MSA level data. We could think of this as sort of a robustness test, given that minimum wage increases have largely moved to cities. But it's also actually, we're going to use it to get some sense of geographic heterogeneity as well. So yeah, we do a couple extensions here. We're going to look at the MSA level. And then we're also going to look at heterogeneity and effects across geographic areas, but also across demographic groups. So I apologize. I should have fewer numbers on this, or a figure of it, at least a red box around the key numbers. But the key numbers I want you to focus on are going to be the 2-year effects. So the change in the minimum wage 2 years ago. This is interacted with the task shares or for the overall employment effects and for the different task shares here. And so we're essentially, in your head, I want you to be comparing these to these numbers here. So the elasticity is close to about negative 0.2 if we want to think about magnitudes and where the effects are coming from. So this is in our MSA level data from the OES. One thing that first comes out, and I'm just going to focus on the 2-year after effects, is that we do also sort of see employment declines at routine cognitive and routine manual jobs on the MSA level estimates, although routine manual is now not statistically significant and the coefficients are smaller. The overall routine tasks estimate is also smaller, a decrease from about negative 0.2 to about negative 0.12. And interpersonal tasks as well has decreased. So when we went to the MSA level data, we expected it to be noisier because the occupation employment statistics then are going to be based on fewer observations. We didn't necessarily expect the effects to be smaller. And so we spent a little time trying to figure out what's going on. One thing that we does seem to be important is that when we exclude the 25 largest cities, the coefficients now get much closer to the negative 0.2 that we observe in the overall state estimates, right? So if you're going to do an MSA level analysis, you're necessarily focusing much more on large urban centers, whereas overall states is going to balance out rural areas as well. This is not going to have any rural areas in it, and so the coefficients go down. When we drop those big cities, it seems to be that the coefficients now look much more similar. So overall, these employment declines, these declines at routine jobs, and the increase in interpersonal seems to be in smaller cities. And so we see the same basic pattern, but it seems to be more effect in rural areas. In the ACS, so now there were a couple issues with using the occupation employment statistics. Again, I just want you to focus on the 2-year effects here. And so there are some concerns, as I said, about using the ACS, using the occupation employment statistics. Here we're going to use the American Community Survey to try and test that. And one nice thing is that the effect definitely just comes through in the American Community Survey in the same way. The elasticities are the same way, same size. And then the timing of the response, that this isn't some artifact of the occupation employment statistics, which is a 3-year moving average, that it's 2 years after is showing up in the ACS as well. So lastly, we use the ACS to try and think about this heterogeneity. And so when we look at less educated workers, again, what I want you to focus on here are just this 2-year effect. So we have the effects increasing a lot more when we start looking at total employment levels of people with a high school degree or less. And so this is going to pick up 2 things. One, this is just sort of heterogeneity across individuals. but also that when we're grouping individuals into an occupation, and this has sort of come up a bit, there's a lot of heterogeneity within an occupation in terms of tasks, in terms of wages. And so when we focus in on those that are most likely to be in the minimum wage job, we get much larger effects. And so this sort of indicates that actually the employment realignment could be even larger on the low wage end of the spectrum. The last thing I want to show you is just by groups, some heterogeneity. Now we just sum up for younger workers and older workers, and this is the decline in routine jobs. It's almost entirely driven by younger workers. When we look at minorities and non-minorities, much larger effect, much larger employment declines for minorities. Men and women looks pretty similar, except when we look at the interpersonal job growth, men are getting an increase here. Some of this just may be that men were not really working in interpersonal jobs previously. But two things that really jump out is just that larger effects on minorities and younger workers. So this employment realignment moving across the labor market, particularly important. And when we look at the overall employment effect, one thing that just sort of to finish on, minorities are being particularly hurt. If we look at the leading effect there, which is elevated employment growth in those states that increase their minimum wage, and then fairly large declines here. So this realignment in employment, which we observe in the first decade of the 21st century, has accelerated quite a bit. And there's some arguments to be made that it may be becoming more costly to low-wage workers, particularly minority workers and younger workers. So I'll finish there. Thanks.
Hi, can everyone hear me? All right, so I want to thank Marcus and thank Brookings for the invitation. I'm going to do what I always hate what discussants do and not talk about the paper. It's for two reasons. One, this is a really well done paper. It's an extension from a previously published paper. Some of the things that they added to that was look at that second post-crisis period. But then also one of the things I really like is the kind of breakdown by race, by age, by sex, and by geography. And so the other thing is I want to kind of bring this together and kind of like do a culmination of this whole event, because automation has been a very sexy topic, talked about a lot. You know, Andrew Yang, popularized it, and a lot of people are always talking about, well, what's happening with automation, how that's going to impact us. And so when I was reading this paper, first thing that popped up was this kind of the ATM story, that when ATMs came, a lot of people were worried that that's going to kill bank tellers. And if you look at the data, what happened is that there actually was an increase in the number of bank tellers. And what happened was that while at an individual bank branch, there were fewer tellers because you didn't need them, but because there were fewer tellers, you could open more branches, and at branches, we need more tellers. And so there was actually an increase. So automation shifted how the nature of the bank teller job, and it went from like routine manual to interpersonal. There are more interpersonal skills. What was interesting in one of your slides, tellers were actually the highest share. So the top 20 routine task for that top 21, but they were the highest percentage of interpersonal. The other thing was there was actually a minus 16% decrease too. So there actually might be an effect there. But one of the things I want to talk about was one of your results. You talked about the impact in rural areas. And so I want to caution you about using the term rural, because this is from the MSA one, right? The OAS. And so rural it's very complicated when you talk about rural, because rural has so many different definitions, and I'm not sure what you're actually capturing as rural as opposed to, say, small metro. So I think because it's the ones without the top 25 large cities is metro, so it's just more of a terminology thing. And the reason why I bring that up is that in the recent minimum wage literature, there's been a lot of discussion about how minimum wage actually doesn't have in certain cases, doesn't have a negative employment effect. And a lot of that's because there's instead of using kind of like the standard neoclassical model, you look at the labor market monopsony model, where there's a lot where firms are able to exert market power. And this is especially true in rural communities where you have that one firm. And so when I was reading the paper and I saw that rural areas don't have a larger effect, I was kind of confused. But if you look at small metros versus actual rural communities, then that result makes sense. So it's more of just kind of a terminology thing. And then the second kind of point I want to make, and I wasn't able to come to the early sessions, but one of the things that I really haven't heard talk about was the issue of race and how race permeates everything. So, and a lot of it, the reason why this actually popped up was in Ryan's talk, he was talking about how the evolution of the middle class and how it became strong. And so he's talking about the GI Bill, the New Deal, all these great programs, but they were exclusionary. They didn't include black, brown people. A lot of cases didn't include gender. And so one of the things that I always think about when we talk about these things, and there was a paper before about union strength, and that, you look at the figure of union membership, and it's like 1950 to like 2010, it's just down. Now, unions in certain cases were also exclusionary, but then the 60s and 70s, they were more integrated. And that happened to correlate at the time when they weren't, there's less they were less popular. And so one of the things, that I think we need to think about is to think about how race is permeated through this. And so also someone was mentioning right-to-work laws and how right-to-work laws have spread. Now, they were first very prevalent in southern states during the 1940s at the same time of union strength, right? And then, over the last probably 20 years, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, I believe, Wisconsin have also passed right to work. And a lot of that has had an impact. And so, and the reason why I bring this up is that we find that in this paper, a lot of these impacts, the ones that people are being harmed, are those who are less educated. When you look at which areas of the country have lower educational attainment, places in the South, places that are correlated with right-to-work laws. You look at the people of color, same thing, right-to-work laws. And so it's something that if we want to start thinking about kind of solutions and policy and how to mitigate some of these harms of coming automation, we have to think about how do we combat these things. And we can't look at it as like, we can't, like this paper is important because it tells us the results, and it's especially nice because it breaks down the results. But the next question is, well, what's the solution? Do we push back on automation, or do we find, a way to incorporate it? And so this also goes back to the previous paper talking about worker power and understanding why, stronger worker power has been a positive impact, and, looking more into that. And so I think the way we have to think about this is, figure out what the impacts are and the differences, geographically, demographically. But then in terms of talking about solutions, or what are some of the things that we can do to actually continue growth with low wage, middle wage, and other groups. And so in the interest of time, I think I'll stop here, and just, again, good paper.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so I'm going to take some questions, and we'll go around the room a couple times, and our authors actually operated pretty much on time, so we have a fair amount of time for questions. Let's start here, and then that's it. And then Richard, then over here. You go.
Just ask the author to elaborate more on just what. Here, what the. Thank you. I just asked the author to elaborate more on what the problem identified in the paper is. From what I saw from the presentation,
Okay, I had just a data question. I'm not an ACS scholar, but Alan, you're an ACS scholar, right? One of the things I do know about ACS is that the sample size has gotten smaller relative to the population, particularly in the period that you're looking at. That's created a lot more noise. I saw your standard errors were bigger for your second half than the first half, but there's a number. It looked like it anyway from the brief description, but is that something you've considered? Are you afraid that that's going to introduce more noise? Because I know other papers that have used ACS have struggled with that issue of shrinking sample size, therefore more noise, and making it particularly hard to do these trend analyses. So just any reflections you have on the data, or and if I've misstated that, then colleagues will correct. But that was it. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rosa, and I'm from George Washington University. And thank you for your presentation. I have one clarifying question and then two second question. So the first one was, if I remember correctly, the decline of the routine job was much more severe into the under 30, is a younger cohort, and I think that was a little bit of inconsistent with what I heard from this morning, the automation, the impact, the older population, they impacted much more for the automation. And I just wanted to hear about some story behind that. And also, I wonder, what do you see all this pattern only for the top 25 metropolitan areas? I am interested in the top metro area these days. Like a lot of low-wage job is actually concentrated in the New York or this like big metropolitan area. And do you see any other distinct pattern and related to this occupational the changing the pattern? Yeah.
Okay, so first we have what's the problem?
Marcus, your microphone.
It's good news.
Can't hear.
So first, what's the problem? ACS issues with ACS sample size, and then discussion of what seems to be a contradicting result. I think that's a pretty interesting observation.
So first, in terms of can everyone hear me clearly? Yes. What's the problem? I think that what we see is the results are actually fairly optimistic. In our first paper, we were fairly optimistic. What we think is interesting is that the pattern of employment is very similar to what's happened to middle skill automation, where you see no net decrease in employment. What's different at the low end of the spectrum is that these jobs generally all require quite little training, and so workers are actually fairly able to move from the destroyed jobs to the created jobs. What our concern is that what's causing this offsetting employment growth, and I didn't really have time today to talk about it. I think it's a really interesting question in the context of a minimum wage to try and think about how you get this offsetting employment growth and what's driving it, whether it's a short-run phenomenon and whether it's a long-run phenomenon. So I think that the potential concerns or the potential problems are that somehow this decline or this increase in the interpersonal jobs, one now looks a little less like it's meeting all of the decline in the routine jobs, so there is some employment loss, but also what's to say that continues into the future. But overall, when you look at low-wage automation, you see a similar pattern in terms of, like I said, employment types of jobs, but it hasn't been as costly to individual low-wage workers as middle-skill automation.
Suggestion on what's causing it.
Sure.
The market.
Well, so the question becomes then, why does it increase in the states that increase the minimum wage? It's just random? No, that's
It could just be the market.
I mean, so, we have a couple of possibilities so, we have some stories. There could be a fixed factor of production, that somehow the adoption of the automation technology eases that fixed factor of production. So if you think about getting coffee at your favorite cafe, right, there's only so much space behind the counter for them to take orders and make drinks. They adopt the automation technology that frees up space behind the counter, which is some fixed factor, and now suddenly they can churn out more drinks. So we have some ideas, potential ideas, but we don't know, we haven't been able to disentangle them yet. It could also be a change across firms. Somebody mentioned that earlier as well about the types of firms, right? So a minimum wage hike is going to be most costly on labor-intensive firms. And so it may be the case that labor-intensive firms fail when the minimum wage goes up, or they're more likely to fail, and sort of the high-tech firms survive, and then they expand and fill the customer demand afterwards. So, that's another story. We have some other ideas as well. Like I said, we haven't necessarily been able to disentangle them, but it seems important to us just because especially in the context of a minimum wage, it's not immediately clear why there would be this offsetting employment growth. And so that has been the saving grace here. And so what's to ensure that it continues? So that was the first one, the ACS trend. So maybe I didn't explain this very well. Our comparison over time, the 99 to 09 and then the 2010 to 2018, that's using the occupation employment statistics. So we're using the OES there. and so the comparison over time. With the ACS, we're using from 2010 to 2018, which may have also decreased in size over that time period. I'm not certain. But I don't know how it would necessarily bias things, but I do think it would add noise. And we do see a tremendous amount of noise because we're taking the ACS and trying to compute total employment levels at the state occupation level. And so we do a few things in the paper that I just didn't go over in the presentation to try and minimize that noise. More, we're using the ACS for the sort of as a robustness to try and understand, whether the OES seems to be accurate, but also to get at some of the heterogeneity stuff which you can't do in the OES. The next one, sort of the decline in younger, different from the older. I think some of the differences maybe between our study and some of the earlier work is just that we're focusing on low-wage workers and as opposed to, say, middle skill jobs. And so when we see a larger effect on younger workers, some of that is just this heterogeneity within occupations, that we see a total employment level, we see an average wage. For some of those workers, the minimum wage is binding, and for others, it's not. For younger workers, it's more likely to be binding. So that would be one way to see that they're going to be much closer to the minimum, and so when the minimum goes up, they're disproportionately affected. It could also be just sort of heterogeneity in terms of who the firm chooses to let go or retrain. But I think some of the differences is just looking at different types of jobs.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that. If you remember some of the work that Besson and some of the other people talked about, was that because they were focused on middle skill jobs, they didn't find nearly as much in terms of demographic effects as they did for other types of, say, splits of the data. I think it's really interesting that you're finding these demographic effects in this segment of the labor market, because I think, as Banga noted, this might be an important distinction in terms of looking at middle skill, sort of routine bias, technological change, and lower wage markets, who tend to be populated by different sets of people by virtue of education.
Actually, I just couldn't resist chiming in because this sort of echoes something that I've been thinking about since this morning, which is, I think there's, a lot of hype about whether on aggregate automation is going to, cause widespread non-employment in the economy. And I think, some of the work this morning kind of suggested like the effects on balance were small, but I think the study really points, and it came up earlier in the day too, to potentially important distributional implications of automation. And so I think when we're thinking about how important this is as a policy issue, there are kind of a couple of different ways to think about it. And one is, what's going on aggregate? Is this really an aggregate crisis in the, economy? And then the other is, if it's not, that suggests a different set of solutions than if it is, but we shouldn't then ignore the, what could be important implications for certain groups defined by their skill level, by their race or ethnicity, by their geography.
I was going to pile on as well, if you don't mind, and bouncing off each other now, which is to ask both of you, given what's just been said, what the policy implications would be. So it's a question to both of you, of particularly, let's take race as the example that you both highlighted, Benga especially. What are the policy implications of the evidence that there are differential influences by race? How should we think about that as policymakers?
So I work at the Center for American Progress. I used to be in academia and moved about 2 years ago, so I think about this all the time. Thank you. I think, and what it's a really difficult topic, because a lot of the issues with race is a large part systemic, but also its behavior. And so what I think about, there was an article earlier this week in the New York Times. It was about African American who worked for J.P. Morgan and was, he was a financial advisor. and there was a woman who had got a settlement, like $375,000. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this is money we're going to help invest. But the people he worked with said, well, no. And they made a statement, said, well, she's Section 8. She wouldn't know what to do with the money. She doesn't respect that money because she didn't earn it. And so the question is, how do you fix that? And then when I see, research like this, and I see, oh, less educated African Americans, across the board. And so it's like there's the aggregate data, there's the econometrics that we do, the analysis that we do, and then there's the individual, like why are African Americans, like what's happening with that group? And so part of it is, we have these institutions, we have these civil rights laws that we need to try to enforce. But the other is a lot more, and Ryan talked about before that there was this erosion of social capital, and that's a problem. But the question is, did we actually have that social capital beforehand? And then so there's a lot of policies that we could do, a lot of laws we could put on the books, a lot of enforcement that we could do. But there's also a lot of we have to, I hate to say this, but like treat each other better. And so it's that combination. But it's really difficult. But I think the important thing is to actually highlight the issue, tell these stories, both the qualitative stories, but then the quantitative analysis to say, hey, this is a problem.
Microphone.
Okay, thank you. What's the problem here? So I think, this is one potential problem, right? So if you look at our results, when you start drilling down on different demographic groups and you think about, the most vulnerable populations, it's important to look at a policy like this or to look at a trend in something like automation of low-wage labor markets and think about how does it disproportionately affect people? And so just sort of highlighting that. I fortunately don't have a solution either.
So on this point, I wonder if you could, in the data or possibly some other data, dig more into the question of whether it's because of segregation of different groups across different, types of jobs or occupations versus the story of, in the face of automating this, introducing some automation here because of the rise in the minimum wage, we're going to upskill some employees and get rid of some other employees. And if the story is like, well, when that happens, we, get rid of the women or the people of color, that's sort of a different story than, well, young people are sort of concentrated in these places that, are prone to this and, they're young. And so maybe they're going to just kind of find their way into, or that might speak to a different response. So I do think that the, sort of digging on that point of, is this just because of the distribution of where people are, or are people who are of different characteristics but kind of doing the same job more or less likely? And I know you have some limitations in the data, but I think just even understanding how segregated different groups are by across types of jobs in this labor market.
That's a great point. Yeah, we have not done that, but that's a great point. We will.
Yeah, I had a question for Brian. It may require crunching some more numbers, but it seems if you're addressing policy, you might want to understand something about the firm sizes of these businesses that you're talking about. I mean, if you have a small operation with maybe 5 or 10 people versus a mega restaurant or, super bar, nightclub of 100 people, automation might have different implications for those businesses.
Yes, totally. And unfortunately, that's not something that we can do with the data that we have here. That doesn't mean that we couldn't look. Like I said, there is this effect, though, that it could change it could change the composition of firms, and there's some evidence that minimum wages do change the composition of firms in favor of bigger firms. So it's not something we can answer, but it's a good point.
Any additional questions?
Yeah, real quick, Nathan Music, Congressional Budget Office. in your results, where you have an increase in the minimum wage for an industry, depending on your characterization of routine versus other, you have a decline in employment, and that could either be because substitution is taking place, capital for labor, alternatively, that the firm's going out of business, as you suggested. So I'm just curious if you've matched up your results, by industry with capital spending, either gross or ICT equipment, to kind of establish that link a little bit more clearly.
So we have not, and it's a good point. We are relying a little bit more. Like I said, there are these newer studies that is getting data on firm investments, even at the industry level. Investments is very difficult, and so we're really relying on sort of the routine bias, technological change story, and these other studies that are out there that are looking at other countries, looking at China and a few other places where this type of data is available. So I think it's a great point. Ultimately, we see a change in occupational employment, and we're inferring that this is due to automation. It would be great if we could sort of draw that connection tighter, and it's something that Dan and I actually have been working on, just we haven't come up with a great solution yet to do it.
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Do we have access to all these draft paper at the end of this event?
So I'll say something after that. So anything else? Okay, great.
So I want to thank everyone for coming to the Future Middle Class Initiatives Automation Labor Market Institutions in the Middle Class Conference. I think this was a great discussion. I want to thank all the authors, some of whom aren't here. They've left already, but James Besson, Henry Sue, Zachary Parolin, and Brian Phelan for presenting some great papers, as well as the discussants, Sarah, Banga, myself. Anyway, so I want to leave on one note to talk about where we're going next with the project. And I think that Sarah's last comment was actually very important in sort of highlighting where we're going. So one of the themes that went around over and over and over today is this issue of education and reskilling and upskilling. And so the next set of issues that the automation theme of the Future Middle Class Initiative is going to focus on is this issue of education, specifically in thinking about the various different, variety of ways, including our formal structures like colleges and universities, K through 12 education, but also thinking about the broad set of other types of alternative vocational education, apprenticeships, and things of that nature that are going on, boot camps, what in our first conference, Paul Osterman called the Wild Wild West of education. And so our next conference, tentatively scheduled for next June, will focus precisely on those issues. And so in the meantime, we hope to produce some material of interest. So I would implore you all to go at least once a week to the automation page and the Future Middle Class website on Brookings.edu to figure out exactly what the next thing that we're working on is. So anyway, I want to thank you all for coming. I enjoyed the conversation immensely. I think we learned a lot. I think we learned some things that we need to investigate more, and I hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.